Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
When I stepped out onto that stage, dressed in a deep emerald gown that clung to me like the confidence I had faked for most of my life, the applause was thunderous, sharp, clean, full of unfamiliar voices, and it echoed like something that should have felt triumphant, but instead felt almost hollow. I scanned the crowd instinctively, even though I already knew what I wouldn't find. Hundreds of people stood on their feet, clapping for me, smiling with admiration I had fought like hell to earn, but not a single familiar face met my gaze. Not one damn person from my family. Not my sister, Katie, who used to braid my hair and steal my clothes. Not my mother, whose cold silence over the years had somehow carved deeper scars than any cruel word ever could. Not even Uncle Rick, who used to laugh too loud and call me little genius every Thanksgiving before he started treating me like a stranger the minute I said I wanted more out of life than just being someone's wife. That entire room had filled with industry names, media execs, CEOs, investors, people who'd flown across the country to see me receive the Lifetime Innovator Award, something only 6 women before me had ever received, and yet, when I stood behind the podium and looked out over that sea of polished shoes and rented tuxedos, I felt a sting I hadn't anticipated, something quiet and mean that clawed its way out from the past. I cleared my throat, forced my mouth into a smile, and for a moment, I could almost see the 12-year-old version of myself, sitting on the kitchen floor, piecing together my first mechanical prototype out of a broken fan and parts from my mother's old sewing machine, watching me from somewhere in the back row. She would have smiled. She would have believed it was worth it. The speech I'd written was neatly folded in my clutch, untouched. I didn't need it. I looked into the cameras, into the lights, and I said, calmly, deliberately, without even a hint of bitterness, "This one's for everyone who said I wouldn't make it." I let the words settle like dust in a quiet house, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone more than that. I stepped away from the mic. The crowd rose again. More applause. More flashing cameras. But I didn't stay for the champagne or the after-party. I didn't want to stand around with strangers while pretending that some champagne toast could wash away the taste of being forgotten by the very people who were supposed to be the first to celebrate me. I slipped out the side door, heels clicking against the marble floors of the hotel, and got into a black SUV that drove me back to my apartment overlooking the park. The whole city was lit up, sparkling like it was cheering me on, and yet there was something suffocating about the silence in that car, the kind that settles when you know the world sees you, but the people you once called your own still choose to look away. Back in my living room, I poured a glass of scotch, something aged, smooth, expensive, the kind of bottle that says, "You made it," even when you don't quite feel it in your bones. I kicked off my heels, let the dress fall to the floor in a pile of silk and sequins, and padded barefoot to the kitchen with my award, still clutched in one hand like a war trophy. I placed it beside the coffee maker, laughed at the absurdity of it, and leaned against the counter. That's when I heard the first ping. My phone lit up with a notification. Then another. And another. 7 messages. All from Katie. And below them, 3 missed calls, each with a voicemail attached. I didn't open them right away. I stared at her name on the screen like it was some kind of ghost. I hadn't heard her voice in almost 4 years. Not since she told me I was too intense, that I made everything about myself, and that maybe the reason nobody in the family talked to me anymore was because I was always so damn dramatic. That was after I refused to send her more money. After she said I'd changed. But the truth was, I hadn't changed. I'd just stopped pretending to be less than I was, stopped apologizing for dreaming bigger than she ever allowed herself to. I sat on the couch, legs curled under me, the scotch warming my throat, and I debated whether or not to open the messages. They could have been apologies. Or they could have been more of the same tired guilt trips. The kind of manipulative, half-baked check-ins that always came with a hidden price tag. The last time she reached out, it was because our mother needed help paying the property taxes on the house she never let me feel at home in. That was 3 years ago. I said no. She said I was selfish. Now, on the biggest night of my life, after they all ghosted me so thoroughly it was like I never existed, here she was, 7 messages deep. And here's where I want to ask you something, because I still don't know the right answer. If someone disappears when you're at your worst, do they deserve to be there when you finally win? And if they only come back when you've got something to show, do you even read what they have to say? Or do you let the silence speak for itself? I didn't open the texts. Not yet. I watched them sit there on the screen, unread, like tiny bombs waiting to go off. And just before I went to bed that night, I played the first voicemail. Her voice came through the speaker, cracked, hesitant. Jen. I saw the speech. I saw it. And I know you probably don't want to hear from me right now, but you don't know the whole story. I didn't either. Mom, she didn't tell you everything. The line clicked off. No explanation. No apology. Just that one sentence, hanging in the air, more disturbing than comforting. I sat in the dark, phone still in my hand, the silence now louder than ever. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. And deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. It was the kind of late November afternoon that always seemed to carry more weight than it should, the kind where the clouds hung heavy in the sky, low enough to almost touch, and the air outside was thick with that familiar blend of fireplace smoke, damp leaves, and family tension that had no name but somehow always showed up right on time. I had parked 3 blocks away from my mother's house that year, not because the street was crowded, but because I needed the walk. I needed the extra minutes to prepare myself for the performance I knew I'd be expected to give, the one where I smiled too wide, made myself small enough to fit back into the role they'd assigned me years ago, and pretended I didn't hear the jabs tucked inside every compliment. The house itself looked the same as it always had, narrow, faded siding with a porch swing that squeaked every time it moved and a wreath on the front door that my mother insisted was timeless, even though it was missing 2 fake pine cones and looked like it came from a clearance bin at a craft store. As soon as I stepped through the front door, I could smell the overcooked turkey, the canned green beans, the pumpkin pie that my sister always insisted she made from scratch, even though the crust came from the freezer section at Safeway. There was laughter in the air, but it wasn't warm. It was sharp, fast, and shallow, the kind that echoed too quickly and left silence trailing behind it like a shadow. Katie was 8 months pregnant that Thanksgiving, wearing one of those clingy knit dresses that showed off her belly and her swollen ankles, glowing in that tired, hormonal way that only women who are carrying too much of other people's expectations tend to do. She hugged me when I walked in, too hard and too long, like she was trying to overcompensate for something neither of us wanted to name. Our mother, as usual, gave me the kind of hug you'd give a coworker you tolerated, then immediately told me I looked thinner than I should be, which was her code for, "Are you eating enough? Or are you still wasting your life chasing some fantasy?" I smiled through it. I always did. That dinner was like every dinner before it, predictable, laced with small digs and long silences, filled with forced laughter and the kind of stories that got told so many times they stopped feeling like memories and started feeling like lies we all agreed to participate in. My Uncle Rick told the same jokes he always did, including one about women in tech that made me put down my fork and stare at my wine glass just long enough for Katie to give me that tight, pleading look from across the table, the one that begged me not to make a scene. So I didn't. I kept my mouth shut, smiled, and asked if anyone needed more stuffing. But what made that Thanksgiving the last one I ever attended wasn't the turkey or the tension or even the casual misogyny. I'd grown numb to all of that. What broke something in me that year was what happened after dessert, when the dishes were stacked in the sink, the coffee had gone lukewarm, and we'd all migrated to the living room where the TV was playing some football game that no one was really watching. I was sitting on the floor, flipping through old photo albums that my mother had pulled from a cardboard box, and I made the mistake of asking about a missing photo, one I remembered vividly, taken on the day I won the regional science fair at 14. Standing next to my project with a trophy in one hand and a grin so wide it nearly split my face in half. My mother looked at me like I had asked her about something shameful. "That one," she said, as if surprised I even remembered it. "We must have misplaced it. Or maybe I took it out because you were wearing that horrible shirt with the bleach stain." She laughed like it was nothing, like erasing a moment of my life didn't matter, and when I didn't laugh with her, she turned away, dismissive as always. I stared at her, heart thudding in my ears, because I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't an accident. That photo had disappeared just like every other thing I had done that didn't align with the version of me she wanted to believe in. Later that night, after everyone else had gone home and the house had quieted down to the usual hum of the refrigerator and creaking floorboards, I found myself alone with Katie in the kitchen. She was barefoot, sipping herbal tea, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly. I asked her softly, so our mother wouldn't hear, why she never said anything when they talked down to me. Why she let them pretend like I was just passing through life instead of building something. She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Because it's easier, Jen. It's easier to keep things simple. You complicate everything." Then she asked if I could help with the baby, just a little money to cover what insurance wouldn't. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and realized for the first time that she didn't see me as her sister anymore. She saw me as a resource, a wallet, a convenient emergency fund when things got tight. I left without saying goodbye that night. I didn't tell them I wasn't coming back. I didn't make a speech or slam a door. I simply slipped out into the cold night, walked the 3 blocks back to my car, and drove home with the radio off, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. That was the last Thanksgiving. The last family gathering. The last time I tried to squeeze myself into a space that had never been built to hold me. Now, sitting in my apartment years later, staring at 7 unread messages and 3 voicemails from the same sister who once told me I was too intense, I couldn't help but think about that night, about that kitchen conversation, and the way she asked for help like it was owed to her. She hadn't reached out since then until now. Not when I launched my company. Not when I made the Forbes list. Not when I buried my dog or finalized my divorce or sat alone on my birthday. Not even when the news broke about the award. But now, after the speech, after the cameras, after the spotlight, suddenly she had something to say. And then, just as I was about to put the phone down, another message popped up from her. "You don't remember the envelope, do you?" she wrote. "The one Mom made you burn?" I stared at that line for a long time, trying to remember, trying to reach back through all the noise and distance and resentment to whatever moment she was referring to. And somewhere, buried deep in the recesses of memory, something flickered. An envelope. A fire. A lie. And I knew right then that the past hadn't finished with me yet. Not even close. There's a strange kind of pain that comes from waiting for something you know isn't coming, a hollow ache that settles somewhere between your lungs and your stomach, the kind of discomfort you get used to carrying like a pocket stone, small enough to ignore in the daylight, but heavy enough to feel in the quiet hours of the night, when the city falls still and the silence presses in from all sides. That's what the years after that last Thanksgiving felt like for me, not a dramatic rupture, not a single devastating moment of abandonment, but something slower and meaner, a long, aching fade into silence that began with missed calls and unanswered texts and ended with my name no longer being spoken at all in the place I once called home. At first, I told myself it was just life, that people drift, that family doesn't have to be in constant contact to still be family, and that we were all just busy, Katie with her baby and her husband and her small-town routine, my mother with her bridge club and her baked casseroles and her slow, methodical disapproval of everything I had become. I told myself I understood, even when birthdays passed unacknowledged, even when I was in the hospital for minor surgery and received no calls, no cards, no familiar voices asking if I was all right. I made excuses for them longer than I should have, because the alternative, the idea that they simply didn't care, was too bitter to swallow. But the truth has a way of creeping in around the edges, doesn't it? It starts with a single moment, standing in line at a coffee shop, overhearing someone complain about a family group chat blowing up over holiday plans, and realizing you've never been part of one. Then it's your assistant reminding you of Mother's Day, and you hesitating for a beat too long before shrugging and saying, "Send flowers, same address," knowing full well they'll go unmentioned, ignored like everything else you try to extend. Eventually, it gets to the point where you stop reaching out altogether, not out of pride or spite, but out of sheer exhaustion, because you can only knock on a door so many times before you realize no one's coming to open it. During those silent years, I built an empire. I poured myself into my company the way other people pour themselves into relationships or hobbies or alcohol, completely, obsessively, with a kind of monastic discipline that left little room for anything else. I lived in airports and boardrooms, in rented condos with views of cities I barely had time to explore, in the half-dark glow of my laptop screen at 2 in the morning while investors slept and competitors schemed. I got married to a man who loved the version of me that smiled for Forbes covers, but had no interest in learning about the girl who once cried herself to sleep on prom night because her father never came home. And when that marriage inevitably dissolved in a flurry of signed documents and divided assets, I didn't cry. I worked through it. I moved on. I had gotten good at that. But what no one saw, what the headlines never captured and the keynote speeches never revealed, was the loneliness that came with it all. Not the kind of loneliness you feel when you're alone, but the kind you feel when you're surrounded by people who only see what you've built and not what it cost you. There were nights I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like to be truly known by someone, to have someone ask how I was and actually care about the answer. Someone who remembered that I used to love thunderstorms, and that I always double-knot my shoelaces, and that I once wanted to be an astronaut, long before I learned that dreams like that didn't belong to girls like me. I remember, clear as crystal, the night my company closed its first $100 million deal. I stood on the balcony of my apartment with a flute of champagne in one hand and my phone in the other, scrolling through my contacts with the sudden, desperate urge to call someone, anyone, and share the news. I passed over old colleagues, ex-friends, former lovers. I hovered over Katie's name for a full minute, thumb trembling, before locking the screen and placing the phone face down on the table. That night, I sat alone in the quiet, fireworks going off in my chest with no one there to witness them. And now, after years of that silence, after all the birthdays and holidays and life events that came and went without acknowledgement, she was texting me like nothing had happened. Like we'd just had a spat. Like we were still those two girls who used to share a room and whisper secrets under the covers and make up dances to boy band songs. I stared at her message. That single cryptic line about the envelope mom made me burn, and something sharp and old stirred inside me. I didn't reply. Not yet. But I typed out a message. 3 simple words. Wouldn't she? I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, those 3 little dots pulsing with a tension I hadn't felt in years. When her reply came, it was short. Too short. She lied. We all did. That was it. No context. No explanation. Just that. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a low, throbbing drumbeat of old anxiety resurfacing. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream, to demand answers. But instead, I poured another drink, sank into the couch, and opened the old wooden box at the back of my closet, the one I hadn't touched in more than a decade. It was filled with scraps of memory, dried-out pens, old journals, faded Polaroids, and one envelope that had somehow survived. Not the one I burned, but a different one I had hidden the same day without really knowing why. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I hadn't seen that name, his name, in over 20 years. And suddenly, everything shifted. The silence wasn't just avoidance anymore. It was hiding something. And I was finally ready to find out what. Memory has a peculiar way of choosing what it preserves and what it lets slip away, as if our minds, in an attempt to shield us from pain or preserve some version of innocence, place certain things behind locked doors, disguising trauma as irrelevance and turning entire moments into shadows until something, some phrase, some scent, some forgotten image, throws the lock open and floods everything back into the present. That's what it felt like when Katie mentioned the envelope, like a pressure valve in my brain had finally been released, and all at once I could see myself again, not as the woman I am now, polished and composed and publicly celebrated, but as the frightened, quietly furious teenager sitting on the back porch with a book of matches and a sealed envelope trembling in her hand, trying to convince herself that obedience wasn't the same thing as trust. I must have been 17, maybe just barely. It was the summer before college, the summer when the house felt more like a prison than a home, when the walls echoed with silence or criticism, but rarely anything in between. My mother had come into my room one afternoon, her mouth tight, her eyes hard in that way that always preceded a lecture or an ultimatum, and she handed me a plain white envelope with no return address, no postage. Just my name on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, not at the time. She said very little, just that it was a mistake, that it shouldn't have come to me, that she needed me to burn it and never ask questions, and that if I ever loved her, I would do this one thing without hesitation. And I did it. I took the envelope, walked out to the back porch, lit a match, and watched the paper curl and blacken and disappear into ash without ever opening it, without even considering disobedience, because in that house, love was measured by compliance. And questioning her, our mother, was a sin of the highest order. I told myself later that it was probably nothing, just some old bill or a relic from a strained friendship, or maybe something connected to the man we weren't allowed to mention anymore, the man we used to call Dad, before he became nothing more than a ghost woven into the fabric of our silences. But now, staring at the message Katie sent, feeling that strange weight settle in my chest, I knew I had been wrong. That envelope had mattered. And she had known it. Katie's second message came with a photo. It wasn't the original envelope, of course. That one was long gone, turned to smoke and ash years ago, but she had apparently found a photocopy, buried in a box of old school papers and drawings. The kind of thing our mother would have kept for sentiment's sake without realizing what it was. The image was grainy, a little blurred, but unmistakable. It was addressed to me. And it was signed by a name I hadn't spoken aloud since I was 12. James Holloway. My father. The man I had been told left us. The man my mother claimed had chosen another life, another woman, over his own daughters. The man whose face I barely remembered, but whose absence had defined so much of who I became. My fingers trembled as I read the words he had written all those years ago. Jenna, I don't know if this will reach you. Your mother made it clear I wasn't welcome, and I have no way of knowing what she's told you. But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wanting to see you. I'll be in town next week. If you want to meet, I'll be at the park on 5th at noon Tuesday. If not, I'll go quietly. I just needed you to know it wasn't my choice. And it never was. I must have read that letter 10 times in a row, each time slower than the last, as if trying to absorb the meaning into my bloodstream, to rewrite the story I had carried for over 2 decades about the man who had supposedly abandoned us without a second thought. And suddenly, all the puzzle pieces that had never quite fit began to click into place, the missing birthday cards that never came, the mysterious boxes our mother sometimes took to the post office but never explained, the fury in her voice any time his name was mentioned, the way she would shut down, cold and distant, whenever Katie or I asked even the smallest question about him. She hadn't just kept him away. She had erased him, rewritten our history in her image, and burned any trace of contradiction before it could threaten the narrative she needed us to believe. I called Katie. For the first time in years, I heard her voice not through a recording, but raw, real, immediate, hesitant. You read it? She asked, her tone tight, uncertain, as if she feared the answer might undo us both. I did, I said, my voice quieter than I expected, laced with something between fury and grief. When did you find it? About 6 months ago, she admitted, in a box in the attic. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't know if you'd even talk to me. You should have sent it the minute you found it. I know, she said, and for once, she didn't try to make an excuse. The silence between us stretched out, thick and complicated. I didn't know what I wanted from her. Forgiveness? Validation? Revenge? Maybe all 3. Maybe none. Did she ever tell you the truth? I asked. No, she whispered. She still says he left us. Still swears she was protecting us. But I don't believe her anymore. Not after that. And neither did I. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out the last journal I had kept before I stopped writing things down, the one from when I was 18, filled with pages of self-doubt and misplaced guilt and carefully hidden rage. I flipped to the back, tore out a blank page, and began writing not for my mother, not for Katie, but for the man I might never see again, the man who had tried, even if only once, to reach me. I didn't know if he was alive. I didn't know if he was still in the state, or the country, or the world. But I knew one thing now with more certainty than I'd known anything in years. She lied. She lied to us both. And I would not let her keep the last word. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it beside the award on my desk, where it could wait until I figured out what to do next. Because the past was no longer content to stay buried, and the silence that had defined my family for so long was finally starting to crack open, revealing secrets sharp enough to cut through even the thickest facade of normalcy. I wasn't sure what I'd find if I kept digging, but I was damn sure I wouldn't stop. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from overwork or lack of sleep or even emotional pain in the traditional sense, but from carrying a truth you were never meant to carry alone. A truth so heavy and tangled that the moment it finally comes to light, it doesn't deliver catharsis or clarity or any of the tidy resolutions that people in movies get to experience, but instead wraps itself around your ribs like a quiet, suffocating thing, reminding you with every breath that what you now know cannot be unknown, cannot be ignored, and most of all, cannot be forgiven without consequence. In the days that followed my call with Katie, I found myself walking through my own life like a visitor, present but distant, aware of every breath I took, but unsure why each one felt heavier than the last, as if grief had begun to move into my bones and settle there. Not because someone had died, but because someone who should have been dead to me suddenly wasn't. I don't know what surprised me more, that my mother had orchestrated such a complete and surgical erasure of my father from our lives, or that she had managed to do it without ever raising her voice, without violence or spectacle, just with quiet authority and a well-placed lie here, a withheld letter there, until the man who had helped create me became little more than a ghost, a question mark at the end of a story I had been told not to ask about. There was a kind of brilliance in her cruelty, a discipline that made it impossible to even call it abuse in the traditional sense, and yet the damage she had done was real, deep, and irreversible, and no apology, not that I expected one, would ever make it right. I didn't go to her house with the intention of confrontation. I didn't need to shout or demand explanations or hold up the letter like a smoking gun. What I needed was something simpler, more intimate, more final, a closing of the loop that only I could initiate. She opened the door herself, which surprised me, because usually she waited behind the curtain until she knew who was knocking. She looked older than I remembered, frilier, her sharpness dulled not by guilt, I was certain, but by time, which had finally begun to carve its lines into her face in a way that no amount of discipline could prevent. "You're here," she said, her voice not quite welcoming, not quite surprised, just neutral, like always, like a woman reading from a script she wrote decades ago and never bothered to revise. "I am," I replied, stepping inside without waiting to be invited, not out of rudeness, but because I refused to play her games anymore. The house smelled the same, lemons and starch, and a faint trace of perfume that hadn't changed since I was a child. Everything was in its place, as if time had been instructed not to move without her permission. I handed her the envelope, not the one from my father, but a new one, heavier, stiffer, with a glossy cover and gold-embossed letters. She took it without looking at me, opened it with a slowness that might have been caution or pride or both, and pulled out the book, my book, the one with my name on the cover and my face on the back flap, and a quote on the dedication page that read, "To the woman who taught me what never to become." Her eyes flicked to the line, then back to me, but she said nothing, just held the book as though it might bite her, as though she were afraid that somewhere between the pages I had slipped in a mirror too honest for her to face. "I thought you should have a copy," I said, my tone light, almost amused, the way someone might comment on the weather while watching a building quietly burn behind them. Still, she said nothing. And so I turned and left, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that felt like punctuation, like the last sentence of a long, unfinished paragraph finally given its period. I didn't look back, not even when the door closed behind me, because I had said everything I needed to say in the only language she had ever truly respected: success. Back home, the city spread out before me like a glittering lie, beautiful and chaotic and full of people who thought they knew me, who thought my story was one of resilience and brilliance and calculated triumph, when really it was a story of abandonment and anger and 1,000 silent moments that no one would ever write about. I poured myself a drink, whiskey this time, neat, and sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the envelope my father had written 2 decades ago, the one that had been turned to ash while I obediently played the daughter who knew better than to disobey. I didn't know if he was alive. I didn't know if he had waited for me that day in the park, watched the benches slowly empty until he realized I wasn't coming. I didn't know if he had tried again, if he had written more letters, if he had ever stopped believing that one day I might find him. But I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt about anything in years, that I had been robbed not just of a father, but of the version of myself I might have become if I had known that I was loved, that I had been wanted, that the story I was given wasn't the only one that could have been told. Katie's last voicemail played as I stared at the skyline, her voice smaller than I remembered, quieter, but for once sincere. "I know you're angry," she said, and she was right, "but I'm proud of you. We were wrong. I was wrong. You didn't deserve what she did to you. And I'm sorry." That was all. No justifications, no defenses, just a handful of words that didn't undo anything, but landed with the weight of something that could have mattered once if it hadn't come so late. I typed a reply. A simple one. "Thank you." But I didn't hit send. Instead, I locked my phone, set it on the table, and walked into the room where a live interview crew waited, lights ready, mics clipped, cameras rolling. The host smiled, and I smiled back, that same practiced smile I'd worn at the gala, the same one I'd learned to wear after every rejection, every betrayal, every moment of doubt. She asked the first question, some predictable thing about resilience, about obstacles, and I leaned forward, hands folded in my lap, posture perfect, tone measured. But all I could think about was how strange it was that after everything, after all the screaming silences and unanswered questions and lost time, it wasn't rage or sorrow that lingered in me now, but something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Vindication. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't slamming doors or screaming truths in crowded rooms or waiting for apologies that never come. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is win. Quietly. And never look back.